This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. 2.5 Admins, episode 289. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your customary Clara article plug, Alan, is ARC and L2 ARC sizing on Proxmox.
Yeah, so following up with last week, if you're configuring your Proxmox, how to tune the ARC to not starve the VMs of memory, but not leave free RAM on the table, and how to use an L2 ARC, especially with the price of RAM. How can we, make up for not having as much RAM as we might like?
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. Data stored in glass could last over 10,000 years, Microsoft says.
So in the past, we've talked about something like this, but it required fused silica, which is really expensive lab-made glass that there's only a couple of manufacturers of, and it made it not very interesting. This new version uses borosilicate glass, which is standard for like beakers and so on in labs, and is also found in a lot of like kitchenware. So this is the kind of glass they mass produce that you can go and buy at a Walmart. And so with this, they can make a glass plate that's 120 millimeters square, so that's less than 5 inches, and 2 millimeters thick, which is pretty thin. And that will store 4.8 terabytes by having 301 layers across that 2 millimeters.
The other interesting thing about the change in the technology is where before, with the really expensive fused silica, they needed 4 pulses of a laser to write a single block of data, and now they can write the same data with a single pulse. It implies a few things. It implies faster writing, if not necessarily reading. It also implies more accuracy and fewer errors, just because every operation that you need to have to complete successfully before something you care about happens means that the whole operation is less reliable because you got more single points of failure. So if you can get the byte written in 1 pulse rather than 4, that's going to do good things for both your error rate and your speed of writing.
Yeah, basically it becomes an atomic operation. Either the pulse happened or it didn't, or it succeeded or it didn't. Not, well, 3 of the 4 pulses worked, so is your data there? Probably not.
We've covered this project before. It's the next big thing in cold storage, hopefully, if it ever makes it to market. The big reason that we're covering it again is not simply because Microsoft has, come up with some interesting new advances like the cheaper glass and, 1 pulse instead of 4. Those are pretty cool in their own right, but I think the biggest part of this story was Microsoft rather quietly saying in that interview that they have moved out of the research phase entirely. There isn't a commercially available product yet, but they're not doing research anymore. They're done with the research. The commercial product comes next.
Yeah, and currently it looks like they can write at about, they say 25 megabits, which is about 3 megabytes per second, but that's per beam. And so if they can have many beams at once, then they can suddenly write this quite a bit.
How does that compare to LTO?
LTO is about 400 megabytes a second. So it really depends how many beams you can get going with this glass technology, which they don't come out and say in the article. But comparing it to LTO in particular, they talk about some of the other big differences. Like obviously with the new LTO 10 that's coming out, they're looking at 30 to 40 terabytes per tape at, like we said, 400 megabytes a second. And, maybe has a shelf life of 30 years, but that's only if you can keep the tape stored between 16 Celsius and 25 Celsius. And you have to do a technology migration every 5 to 10 years to keep it refreshed and so on. Whereas this glass, admittedly with artificial aging testing, but the glass looks like it would last 10,000 years and not require necessarily doing these refreshes every 5 to 10 years. And so that can be a lot more interesting. As they say, a lot of archival estates, when they have a failure, it's rarely because, the cartridge chemically degraded on schedule. It was more that they fail because of, a compatibility window closes. They don't make a drive generation change. Some firmware broke. A robot needs, all the other bits of the system, kind of like Jim was just saying, if there are many steps to doing this, any one of those steps can fail. Whereas if you can keep it more simple, then it's less of a problem. And so most of the time when you have an LTO recovery failure, it's not because the tape degraded, it's because you depended on all of these different elements. Do you have the right software? Do you have the right firmware? Does the hardware still work? Can you buy a drive that can read that kind of tape 20 years from now? et cetera, et cetera.
There are also only so many read operations you can get out of an LTO tape. We're presuming very cold storage in a very well climate controlled place, to get this idea of, decades of reliable storage out of it. For those of us who are old enough ever to have needed to listen to music on Philips cassette, you remember how when you played it too long, like first everything gets all muddy and then eventually like it starts going wah, 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 because the actual physical tape stretches even after the media degrades? These are some of the kind of failures that you can have with tape. You have to have it so climate controlled because everything from heat to moisture to, physical stress to you name it has a huge impact on the quality of the media. By comparison, you could put one of these things in the dishwasher and run it for a cycle and it would be better when it came out than it was when it went in because the only thing you'd have done is clean smudges off the glass. And for those of you who have been burned, with CDs and DVDs that did not live up to their claimed retention time and started failing within a few years because of dye degradation issues or separation of the plastic from the foil. There are a few things that I want to talk about here. And one is that although, yes, these are both optical mediums, and yes, there's a laser involved in both cases, it's not the same thing. The kind of CD or DVD that you would have bought to burn and then had problems with, it's not a piece of glass that you're altering with a laser. It is a very, very thin sheet of foil sandwiched between two sheets of cheap plastic with some dye that you're burning with a laser. Whole different story from, literally altering a chunk of glass. Again, like Alan said, this is the kind of glass that you would have in like a laboratory beaker or like, a really nice heavy measuring cup that your mom might have bought in the 80s, for the kitchen. Like this is not fragile stuff. And for me, the idea of cold storage that it's impervious to any magnetic issues, heat issues. Well, I mean, it's not impervious to heat issues, but as long as you're not literally applying a blowtorch to it, it'll be fine. No cold issues, no moisture issues. I'm pretty excited about this technology.
Yeah, cold storage that is immune to heat and cold, but also dust and moisture. Dampness is one of the things that destroys both cellulose type stuff like tape and hard drives and anything electronic very easily. The number of places we saw where, a hurricane hit and all the hard drives got wet and the data's gone, if it's a glass, if all you have to do is put it in the dishwasher to get the dirt off and your media works again, that's pretty compelling.
This is essentially the first cold storage technology we've had that we could really, truly contemplate, thousands of years worth of readability out of since fired clay tablets.
Nvidia plans a PC system on a chip setting up direct competition with Qualcomm, Intel, and AMD.
This is another one of those, for God's sake, bring out the antitrust laws kind of situations for me. I'm already unhappy with the degree to which Nvidia has kind of bent the entire tech industry to its will recently. We've seen circular investing with Nvidia lending money to companies so that they can buy more of Nvidia's products to put into, AI things that company hopes to eventually sell. And now we're seeing Nvidia trying to cut other companies completely out of the space. And I just have to ask it, at what point do trust busters actually step in and start regulating the freaking market? If we end up with Nvidia as the default company to produce not only GPUs for gaming, not only GPUs for scientific and AI stuff, but also like the entire system for everything, how does the market provide competition to that when you wind up with a situation where one single company is providing everything? And if you think it would stop there, I got news for you. I cannot possibly imagine that if this gets pulled off, we don't eventually start seeing an NVIDIA operating system to go along with it. I mean, this is just vertical integration writ large. And the thing about vertical integration is it looks really efficient when it's brand new and you're like, this is a great idea. Why would we split things up? Why would we, to use a slightly different term used in different contexts, why would we go to the inefficiency of federating things? Well, you do that because the company or the entity that you trust today may not be trustworthy tomorrow. And if you don't have any other options, you're screwed. NVIDIA has already bent this market to its will, even without this new thing. And I'm not happy about the idea of them managing to kill off the CPU industry as well as the GPU industry.
I think the other thing that's interesting here is, has Qualcomm been successful with their attempt to make these AI laptops? Like, I remember when there was the big hubbub about them launching a Windows laptop, but I've not heard anything about it since. And most of the stuff we heard back then, I think when we covered it, was that Microsoft recall thing where it was going to use the TPU or NPU to record everything you were doing and be able to rewind or whatever.
That's essentially the problem with it. The recall feature is really what those got known for, and it's so wildly unpopular that the rest of it never really took off. With that said, I would argue that yes, Qualcomm has been technically successful, but they've had a real branding problem. Qualcomm has become synonymous with, well, that's the crappy thing that, isn't really a proper processor like Intel or AMD, and also isn't really a proper mobile processor, like Apple's A series. Qualcomm is seen as the also-ran of things that are just barely good enough to be Android. And I would certainly argue that Qualcomm has been producing CPUs for quite some time that compete very decently in the budget to mid-range PC space, but they just don't get any traction there because of that, that branding recognition issue.
And I don't think Nvidia would have as much of that problem.
Nvidia would not have that problem at all because Nvidia is not seen as the also-ran that makes things cheaply that are just good enough for the cheap thing. Nvidia is seen as the premier source for the things that you really love. That's what makes your Call of Duty games so great. So of course you'd want the whole Nvidia PC, wouldn't you? Before we close out on this one, a little bit more information. This is not just pie in the sky. This is not just Jensen Huang, offhandedly saying something in a conference. This system on chip that we're discussing, it's something that Dell and Lenovo are planning to actually build desktops around this processor later this year. The chip doesn't exist yet, at least, not out in the retail world, but it's going to be based on an existing chip that has been used in a lot of high-end AI workstations called the GB10, which NVIDIA developed with MediaTek. So there are some engineering challenges in basically downclocking, this very high-end AI system on a chip in order to get it down to, a power budget that's going to be acceptable to consumers. But that's very different from just saying, hey, we think we'd like to build a system on a chip and we're going to start looking into that. This is not hypothetical or maybe. This is plans that are in the works.
Yeah, and like I said, with Dell and Lenovo as OEMs already, this is going to be things that people are going to be able to buy in short order. And that's going to be interesting to see what that does. I don't know what the adoption rate for the ARM version of Windows has been, but I expect this is going to start to drive some more of it.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Automox. If you're evaluating endpoint management solutions, the real risk isn't which tool you choose, it's choosing one without a proven blueprint for success. Because while most endpoint tools promise automation, next to none promise outcomes. That's why Automox introduced Turnkey results. Turnkey removes the uncertainty that holds endpoint automation back. It delivers a personalized results blueprint, so Automox is configured and operated to achieve real outcomes from day one. No trial and error, just clarity. Each blueprint is validated across millions of endpoints managed by Automox and tailored to your specific environment, your risk tolerance, and your operational goals. Instead of guessing how aggressive to be with automation or how to configure policies safely, start with a plan you can trust. And you can choose to implement the plan yourself or have Automox do it for you. Either way, you get faster time to value, lower risk, and predictable endpoint outcomes. Automox Turnkey results. Know the plan, trust the result. Learn more at www.automox.com. Do you ever read a headline and an article and then think, yeah, of course people are doing that really stupid thing that I would have never thought to do myself? Well, Vibe password generation, predictable by design. Don't use LLMs to generate passwords. And I don't think that our audience needs to be told that, but maybe their users might be doing this and, family, friends, that sort of thing.
Yeah, this is just, I don't know, shake my head. I'm just confused about how people thought this was a good idea. But once it was brought up to me, I was like, yeah, I can see people doing that. I don't know how they got to the idea that was a good idea. But yes, I can see people doing that. And wow, the amount of terrible that goes into that.
I got to be honest, I think I can see where people came to that idea. And This isn't a universally popular take, obviously, but I think it's the same reason ultimately that leads to almost every instance of LLM use, and it's just sheer freaking laziness. It's, I don't want to bother doing this, and there's a fake person I can ask to do it for me, and that is the easiest possible way to get through this. This is an example of what I like to call being fractally wrong, where like you're not just wrong on the surface, like there is layers to how wrong you are. And every time you peel the onion back, you're like, oh my God, there's more wrong underneath here. Because, you know, at the basic level of it, you're asking an LLM to give you a password. It's the same LLM, typically, when people are doing this, that anybody can ask to give them a password. And like, you probably already wouldn't drive down to the Home Depot and like look for dudes hanging out in the parking lot and roll down your window and ask, hey, can you give me a password? And then actually use it. You probably wouldn't do that, right? And yet, that's the first layer of how dumb it is to ask an LLM to give you a password. Now, the second layer is you have to understand you didn't just drive to the Home Depot parking lot and ask some random guy to give you a password. There's a guy in the Home Depot parking lot with a sign that says free passwords, and there's a whole big line of cars queued up, and they're all asking for a password from the same guy. Does that sound like a good idea? No. And now we get down into the technical reason that I personally find the most hilarious layer of like why this is such a bad idea. What is an LLM, really? It's a word predictor. It predicts the next most likely thing in a sequence of human communication, which means it is literally the exact opposite of a pseudo-random data generator. It's trying to give you the down-the-middle default answer that will please everybody. So just, oh, no.
Yeah, so this company, Irregular, did some investigation of this and prompted various LLMs to spit out passwords. And surprise, surprise, there were recurring patterns and in some cases, actually the same password several times. Now, this is pretty obvious to most of us listening to this, right? You don't go to an LLM and ask it for this. But there's actually something more serious here, and that is AI agents. Now, there are people administering systems, creating software using AI agents, and passwords need to be generated for a lot of the stuff that's happening here. And instead of using the built-in tools to standard operating systems to generate these passwords, they're using LLMs to generate them and baking them into stuff that should not be having this kind of thing. This is much more serious than just your average person who's not technical asking their favorite LLM for a password. This is potentially a ticking time bomb, I think.
So most of these randomly generated passwords, you know, they appear, if you're just looking at one of them, to be, you know, the typical, like if you're to use a password manager in your browser, and, you know, most of those are not doing like diceware passphrases. You're just getting, you know, a certain number of characters of ASCII line noise, basically. And again, you have to understand that there is no pseudo-random number generator algorithm in an LLM. There is none. At the most optimistic level, this is like asking, you know, whether you want to use the example of like some rando in the Home Depot parking lot, or whether you want to say, you know, like a 10-year-old kid. Ask a 10-year-old kid to come up with 500 different randomly generated line noise passwords. Well, there's going to be a lot of patterns in there. That's why you're not supposed to generate them yourself. If you're using line noise for passwords, actually, even if you're using passphrases, you're supposed to be randomly generating these tokens using an actual pseudo RNG algorithm, because if you just try to do it as a human, you will inject patterns because you're not a random number generator either. You may not see this if all you make is one or two passwords, but if you are in a role where you're coming up with new secrets all of the time, you will very quickly discover, if you're trying to do it off the top of your head and you're actually paying attention, you really care about what you're doing, you realize, man, my brain keeps trying to give me these same random words to put in these passphrases. Or, you know, if you're trying to do just the random line noise thing, well, if you're just like bashing your hands on the keyboard, Well, do that enough times to generate a few hundred passwords and look at the list of them and look at the patterns that repeat in every one of those things. Now, when you've got repeating passwords, what you have is no longer something that requires a brute force attack, but something which can be attacked with a hybrid or a dictionary lookup attack because you've got an insight. You're not just having to go through all of the supposed naively calculated entropy because you know something about how that attacker is generating those secrets. And that allows you to kind of jump to the head of the line, basically.
Yeah, you would think the LLMs would have some safety protocol that says when someone asks you to do that, tell them to get a password manager.
Yeah, you'd think that, wouldn't you? Yeah.
Joe mentioned the list of passwords that the Irregular asked Claude Opus 4.6 to generate for it. And out of the first 9 of those supposed randomly generated passwords, all of which appear to be ASCII line noise, 8 of the 9 begin with G7 and, then one of the symbols if you hit shift and a number key on your keyboard. The 9th of those first 9 starts with K7 and then a symbol for the shift in the first few numbers on the keyboard. Like, it's even worse random number generation than asking a kid to do it.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. An anonymous person writes, do you have any tips on whistleblowing when sensitive customer data isn't being taken seriously? For example, a database is storing passwords in clear text, or there are hard-coded backdoor passwords that can be used to exfiltrate sensitive data that doesn't belong to your company in the first place. If you find this sort of problem, what are your options?
So the first response for ethical whistleblowing is going to be to bring it up officially with your company, with your bosses. You should write up a memorandum that explains the not best practice that you discovered and, what the real world ramifications for following that very much not best practice are, how this could badly impact customers and how it could badly impact the company itself. Ideally, if you go to the trouble of actually producing this well-supported document and submitting it formally to the company's hierarchy, ideally, you'll get some engagement on that. If you don't, that's when things get a little bit difficult because that's when you have to decide whether you want to escalate beyond the company, whether you want to do like a public disclosure. And the unfortunate thing there is if you do wind up deciding to do public disclosure, you can't really do it very anonymously if you've already written a memo explaining exactly why that bad practice is bad and your company shouldn't be doing it. So if you're even considering going public with whistleblowing, you should probably consult an employment lawyer and, make sure that you've got all your I's dotted and all your T's crossed. You need to make sure that you don't violate any company NDAs, anything in your employment contract. You don't want this to come back and bite you in the butt because if you're not working for a truly massive organization with a team with dozens or even hundreds of people working on a project that, has these poor practices that you discovered. If instead you're working for a smaller company, with only a handful of developers, well, it's probably not going to take them too long to figure out who the rat is.
What Jim said of, get the problem in writing so that the company later can't claim you didn't tell them. If you just talk to your boss about this instead of writing a memo, then you don't have this paper trail saying, I raised this issue here. The company knew about it and did nothing about it for so long. And then a bad thing happened. And it's like, I told you so. And they try to claim they didn't know and so on. It can be very tricky to be in this situation because, you know that something bad might happen and nobody seems to want to do anything about it. And, this can have a lot of implications. Like if the company has insurance against certain types of cyber crimes and so on that might happen to them, but they knew they were doing something against the best practice here that could invalidate their insurance. And again, that might be one of the things that you try to put in the memo being why the business leaders need to consider this not just the complaining of a techie, but actually, there's a real business risk here that our insurance won't cover us if something bad happens because we're doing this thing the wrong way. And short of that, I don't have a lot of practical advice there other than I know a few news outlets and so on, journalistic places like ProPublica have best practice guides on leaking information anonymously to make sure that you don't leave a trail back to you. But as Jim said, if you're in a small group and you've already complained officially about this and then the news gets out, there's going to be a lot of fingers pointing at you very quickly. So that advice may have limited value.
Another resource you might consider is reach out to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They kind of specialize in this sort of thing, and they will be able to give you at least some guidance on, what your rights are, what your responsibilities are. And, they'll have quite a bit of experience with, how this kind of thing can play out. So the big takeaway here is you don't want to just YOLO this. You really want to have a plan, and you want to follow that plan, and that's going to be your best chance for a good outcome on this. The other thing I'll mention, if you do decide to disclose publicly, there are a few ways to do that. If you were already an InfoSec person, well, you just take to your blog and you say whatever you wanted to say. That seems to be how most InfoSec disclosures get carried out. However, if you're not already an InfoSec researcher with a pretty big name who's willing to weather a storm, you could also consider reaching out to a well-established, tech news organization. ProPublica is one choice, Ars Technica is another, or the Register. And, reach out to a journalist there. And you do need to make it clear that, if you want to remain anonymous, that you intend to remain anonymous. You can't just say that after the fact. Before you give any details, you need to make it clear that you are an anonymous source. Be clear about that from the jump. You don't want a reporter to have amassed pages of really juicy quotes from the information that you've given them, and then say, after they've already written half their story, oh, by the way, you can't use my name. That's actually not how that works. And while some journalists will honor that kind of thing sort of after the fact, others won't because they don't have to.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.